Olivia, you are always like the first person on.
Yeah.
Wow, that was loud in my ear. How's everybody doing?
Good, it's Friday.
You're glad it's Friday?
Yes.
Yeah, it feels weird to me. I feel like life is careening out of control, yet all I ever do is come to my office and go back home and occasionally go grocery shopping.
Yeah.
Friday is for me at the beginning of the work week, so it's like flipped on its head.
Is it? When I was an undergraduate, I was working my way through college because I was a first generation college student. I didn't know how college worked, and neither did my parents. And so I ended up taking this job as a security guard at a hospital. Saw all kinds of weird stuff, but it was one of those situations where you worked 36 hours over the weekend and got paid for 40. And by the end of that year, I was just toast. I couldn't tell what end was up. I thought I could handle the workload, but I could not, evidently. So I feel your pain. Where do you work?
I work in a paint department at Menards.
Okay. How's everybody else doing?
Pretty good.
You're good. I noticed on the blog that there weren't earlier in the week there weren't a lot of posts after September 30th. So if you haven't done your posting for this past week, please do so. And also, this is the end of this 2 weeks of food journaling and food blogging. So I'll try and get up some new prompts for you by the end of the day today. So just, I noticed that people hadn't been blogging lately, and I just wanted to call your attention to that. So that's that. Any questions about anything?
I might have missed it, but I didn't see anywhere to turn the food journals in.
Let's see. Go away. All right. Oh, there it is right there. Food journaling from 28th October to 28th September to 9 October. It is in the week that it started, which is
Okay, thank you.
yeah, right there. So okay. So it's there. I'll try and put them on the Friday that it begins. That was one of those ones where I had forgotten to post one and it got stuck in there at a slightly odd place, but it's right next to the food blogging prompts. So and it starts the 28th because the 28th is the following Monday. And for those of you who turn in your food journals physically, I take the weekend to read through them. So you might also have noticed that in some cases I'm asking you for more detail. And so if you could provide that, that would be great. It's just so, you know, if if you give me like kind of the title of a meal, if I'm not familiar with that, I have no idea what that is. And so anyway, so I'll try and get those posted later on this afternoon. And if you haven't finished the previous assignment, then certainly get that done by the end of the day today. Try not to put them off until the end if you can, but like I said, I was just on there poking around earlier in the week and I noticed people hadn't posted in a while. So I was like, okay, what's up with that? All right, other questions? All right, we're trying to make our way through nutrient cycling. So I had started to introduce nutrient cycling through the carbon cycle at the end of class last time. Can you guys see my screen? Okay, so in the carbon cycle, we basically have these kind of two fundamental ways of moving carbon around in ecosystems. One is taking carbon dioxide out of the air, converting it into glucose. Glucose is then stored inside of the bodies of plants and the bodies of animals to a certain degree. And then when we need energy, we take that glucose and we break it down back into carbon dioxide and water. And the energy from the bonds in glucose ends up producing energy, which we see as heat in many cases. So anytime you release energy, it generally generates some form of heat. It's what we call an exothermic reaction. But the first thing you have to do when you start thinking about kind of the structure of a cycle is to ask yourself, where are the different pools of the substance that you're interested in? In this case, we're interested in carbon. And what forms does that atom take in those different pools? So we can think of pools in the carbon cycle as being the atmosphere. And in the atmosphere, what form is carbon going to take?
Gas.
Yeah, it's going to take the form of a gas. It's going to be carbon dioxide. Then we have organisms, and we have both plants and animals. So we could put plants and animals in separate boxes if we wanted to. We put the atmosphere in its own little box. How do we get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and into plants and animals?
Plants through photosynthesis.
Okay, so we're going to move it from here to there through the process of photosynthesis. And so it's going to appear in plants as glucose. And so photosynthesis is the flux. It's the movement from one pool to another pool. And in the process of going through that flux, it actually changes form. So in some cases, flux is just the movement from one pool to another. But depending on the nature of the flux, it can also involve a transformation of the substance. In this case, the transformation from carbon dioxide, a low energy molecule, to glucose, which is a high energy molecule. How do animals get their glucose? They can't do photosynthesis, clearly.
They get it through eating the plants.
They get it through eating the plants. So this is another flux. In this case, it's a specific flux called herbivory. Herbivory is just a fancy pants way of saying animals eating plants. But the form doesn't change. The glucose stays glucose. So this is of movement of glucose from one pool to another pool, but it doesn't have a transformation of the form of the carbon. While plants and animals are going about their lives, they're using glucose to gain energy. And so this energy gets used up, glucose gets used up, it gets broken down to carbon dioxide and water. Where does that carbon dioxide then go after plants and animals have used that to generate energy? It's the second equation that's on the screen. What do we call that equation?
Isn't it cellular respiration? It goes back into the atmosphere when we breathe.
Yep. So both of these arrows would represent cellular respiration. It's breaking down the glucose to release energy that plants and animals are then using, and it returns carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. So plants and animals are on the landscape. Plants and animals live out their lives, but then eventually plants and animals do what?
They die.
They die. And when they die, we normally think of them as going into the soil, which is this big pool. And so within the big pool of soil, there is a pool of soil carbon. And this particular transformation is death. And within the soil, carbon, well, so let's do this. Let's do this differently. When these bodies of these animals get into the soil, we would generally refer to it as soil organic matter. And this includes actually the actual bodies of dead animals, but it also includes things like leaves falling off of trees. All of that organic material gets into the soil. And what happens to it once it gets into the soil? If you take your leaves and pile them up in a compost bin in your backyard, what eventually happens to them?
They break down.
Yeah, they break down. Does anybody know the term that we use for the breakdown of dead things?
Decay.
Decay is one word. There's a more scientific word though.
Decomposition.
Decomposition. And so this soil organic matter basically goes through the process of decomposition. And this is accomplished by bacteria. And this decomposition is going to basically take the glucose that is in this dead soil organic matter, and it's going to essentially, the bacteria are going to use it for energy, and it basically gets shot back into the atmosphere. And the term that we use to describe this is what we call soil respiration. It's cellular respiration done by organisms inside the soil. And those organisms are generally microbes, bacteria, and fungi for the most part. So what we can do is over time, we can slowly build up where are all of the pools for carbon in a system, and how does carbon move from one pool to another pool. And what I've done on the next slide here is I formalize this. So we've started on this, but it's going to get complicated and it's going to swamp my ability to build it on the board to a certain degree. So we'll just look at a final version and I'll walk you through it. So I generally try and think about the big pools first. So let me explain what's going on in this diagram with you. So this big box, this big rectangular box here in the middle of the frame, that's soil. And so I'll always put animals and plants sitting on top of soil. And then I'll always illustrate plant roots as being under the soil. And so we have the atmosphere up here. We have fossil fuels, which we'll talk about a little later. We have groundwater, which doesn't really play much of a role in here. So if we think about the atmosphere, there is a lot of carbon in the atmosphere. So this is 760 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon floating around in the air. So that's 760 times 10 to the 15th. That means there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 zeros after this. So this is how many grams of carbon are in the atmosphere. So that is a very big number. So there is a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, even though carbon dioxide makes up a relatively small proportion of the composition of the atmosphere. Because the atmosphere is so big, it ends up being a huge amount of carbon floating around in the atmosphere. Now, what we can then ask is, well, how much of that carbon each year leaves the atmosphere and is fixed by primary producers? And that ends up being about 120 of this is taken out of the atmosphere in the form of photosynthesis. And so that's a pretty big chunk. So plants are really important in mediating carbon flow in ecosystems. So 120 of this 760 comes out of the atmosphere and enters plants. Oh, there's a serious arrow that I have failed to put into my whole thing here. I don't have the simulation. I don't have the movement, the herbivory of animals eating plants, and I'm not sure why. But some of this, a good chunk of this carbon that is fixed by plants makes it into animals, and the combination of plants and animals using that for cellular respiration is about 60. So about 60 of that is returned back to the atmosphere through cellular respiration. So that's what this respiration right here is, 60 times 10 to the 15 grams per year. These plants and animals die. They make it into dead organic matter in the soil that is glucose. And of that dead organic matter, it's decomposed. And that decomposition goes into carbon dioxide that is in the soil. And about 55 grams of that is returned to the atmosphere. So not all of the decomposition results in return to the atmosphere, but most of it does. And the part that doesn't return to the atmosphere gets stored as soil carbon, which is about 5 grams per year, 5 times 10 to the 15th grams per year. So of this 60 that's coming out of dead organic matter into the soil, most of that gets blown back to the atmosphere as soil respiration, but the rest of it stays in soil as soil carbon. So another 55 goes back to the atmosphere as soil respiration. There's also small amounts that get put into the soil through the excretion of animals and things like that, but all of that ultimately gets handled by decomposition of soil microbes. So if we just look at a kind of undisturbed natural environment without humans, what you generally find is that photosynthesis accounts for about 120 times 10 to the 15 grams of carbon coming out of the atmosphere into the biotic components of ecosystems. Those organisms then blow about 60 of that back to the atmosphere through respiration, and then soil microbes blow about 55 of that back to the atmosphere due to, once again, soil respiration, this process of decomposition. But that means that there's 5 times 10 to the 15th grams per year stored in soil. So if we take the 120 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year that comes out of the atmosphere, we return 60 of that through cellular respiration. That leaves 60 left. And if we then return 55 of that back to the atmosphere through soil respiration, that leaves us 5 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year that is stored in soil. And so under normal conditions, under conditions where humans aren't disrupting the carbon cycle, we should actually be pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere at a higher rate than we're putting it back into the atmosphere. And that's what this storage in soil carbon is all about. But what happens is humans come along and they do certain things. So one of the things that we do as humans is we basically convert forests primarily over to agriculture. In the process of converting these forests to agriculture, we end up burning a lot of biomass. A lot of the trees get burned off of the surface of the earth. And as a result, it takes about 3.8 times 10 to the 15 grams. So of this 5 that we would normally store, about 3.8 of that gets blown back into the atmosphere due to land use change. And like I said, most of this is due to the fires that are associated with land use change. That only leaves 1.2 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year that is stored, that we have in terms of net storage. But then in addition to that, we also drive cars and heat our homes with fossil fuels and things like this. So fossil fuel deposits represent carbon stored from photosynthesis millions of years ago. So millions of years ago, plants grew on the surface of the land. Those plants, as they died and decayed, they ultimately got incorporated into sedimentary rock over time. Heat and pressure converted that dead, decaying vegetation into things like oil, natural gas, and coal. And we burn those things off as fuel for our cars, fuel for our factories, and fuel to heat our homes. And we burn up about 5.3 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year. And so 5.3 minus 1.2, that's 1. So now we have a net export of 4.1 times 10 to the 15th is being added to the atmosphere every year. And so through human activities, we've taken a biogeochemical cycle that would normally store soil in the carbon, a system that would normally store carbon in soil. And because we burn off more plant matter on the surface of the land, and we're dredging up these old fossil fuel deposits, that is the previous activity of photosynthesis from millions of years ago, we take this system from a system that would normally be storing carbon and removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to a system that puts more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than gets stored. And as a result of this, we see carbon dioxide levels going up every year, and they go up by about 4.1 times 10 to the 15th grams of carbon per year, which might seem small when you consider that this is the amount that is going back into the atmosphere each year. And so you might say to yourself, well, that's a really small part of the total composition of the atmosphere every year. But Google, just for a minute, Google the composition of the atmosphere. Go to your web browser. Why did I pause screen sharing? I don't recall pausing screen sharing. Now I have to go back and share again. Are you guys Googling composition of the atmosphere? What's the atmosphere made up of?
21% oxygen, 0.93% argon, 0.04% CO2.
What was
and
the
then
CO2? What was CO2?
0.04%.
You're breaking up on me.
0.04%.
0.04%. Nitrogen is what? Why does it not even include nitrogen? Nitrogen is like 78%.
Yeah, I have found a graph that says nitrogen 78.
Yeah, so nitrogen in the form of nitrogen, diatomic nitrogen, is 78%. Oxygen is 21%, and then everything else is something really small. So that's basically 99%. And so all the other things that are floating around in the atmosphere are in that last 1%. So this is the amount in terms of percentages, 0.04 of 1%, that is carbon dioxide. So this, even though this seems like a really big number, it's a really small proportion of everything floating around that we breathe in every day, so that even small changes to this have a large increase in kind of the concentration of carbon dioxide that is in the atmosphere. So one of the reasons that I want you to, you guys see my screen? Yeah, okay. So one of the reasons that I want you to know the carbon cycle is, first and foremost, it's one of the easier cycles to remember, because there's only two forms of carbon that occur, glucose and carbon dioxide for the most part. And it doesn't move around through a lot of different intermediate pools. There's the atmospheric pool, there's the biotic pool, and then there's this oil pool. And then we have this fossil fuel pool that is deep in the ground that only comes into this because of the activities of human beings. But the other reason that I want you to learn the carbon cycle is not only is it easy to model and easy to kind of wrap your head around, it's also important for things that are important today, like increasing levels of carbon dioxide. So this increase in carbon dioxide, which is expressed here in parts per million, this is parts per million in the atmosphere, has been going up historically since they started measuring. The blue information is from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in California. And then in 1974, they moved this monitoring to the peak at Mauna Loa in Hawaii. And so, but what you've seen is a steady increase in the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The reason that people are concerned about this is that carbon dioxide is one of these gases that tends to trap heat in the atmosphere. Explain to me why this line wobbles around the long-term average. There's a yearly peak and decline, peak and decline, peak and decline, peak and decline, peak and decline. What's causing that peak and decline in the amount of carbon that is floating around in the atmosphere? So these are monthly readings. There should be clues in this figure as to why this figure looks the way it does.
Is it related to farming?
It's not related to farming. What here might vary seasonally? What in this figure might vary with season? Which one of these fluxes would vary seasonally?
Plant life.
Okay, go into some more detail about that.
So I mean, in terms of a lot of perennial plants would go out of season, would die, and then give nutrients to the ground or put CO2 in the air when they're live.
Okay, so these plants. So Blair, you're sitting in front of a window right now, and so is Olivia. Anybody else sitting in front of a window or near a window? Look out the window and see what's happening outside right now to the trees in particular.
Actually, I'm outside right now.
You're outside. Okay, so you don't even have to look outside. You are already outside. Are the trees turning color?
They're changing colors and falling to the ground.
They are falling to the ground. I just got gutter guards up on my garage this past week, and they have already started, catching the leaves and keeping them from going into my gutters, so that hopefully I won't have to clean my gutters quite so often every year. So these leaves are falling on the ground. So Blair, it isn't that the trees are dying; they're just senescing because of the oncoming fall and winter. They're shedding their leaves, and because they're not going to be getting enough solar energy to be doing a ton of photosynthesis anyway. And while they're shedding their leaves, they're also removing any possibility of losing water through their leaves during the winter. And so they're not dying, but they're shedding living parts, and those parts are then going to decompose. But it's not that decomposition is increasing a lot during the winter. What is decreasing during the winter because of this shedding of the leaves?
The amount of photosynthesis that's happening.
The amount of photosynthesis. So what happens in the wintertime is photosynthesis in the northern hemisphere shuts down because all of these plants are not doing photosynthesis because they've shed their leaves because of the seasonal senescence of leaves that we see in temperate regions. Plants and animals are still doing respiration. So respiration isn't really changing very much. And soil respiration probably isn't really changing all that much because soils are buffered from the effects of climate to a large degree. And so what's really changing is photosynthesis is going down, which basically means that while photosynthesis is going down, because respiration stays the same, you're getting a net movement of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, not because respiration is increasing, but because photosynthesis is decreasing. And so what you see yearly is you see CO2 levels peaking in winter, declining in summer, 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 peaking in winter, declining in summer. But of course, this peak and decline is going ever upward over time. But you might say to yourself, Dr. Kleminski, you have a very northern hemisphere sort of centric way of thinking about this, because we think about winter being the time in North America when trees lose their leaves, and as a result, they're doing less photosynthesis. But don't trees keep their leaves during our winter in the southern hemisphere? Why is that not a valid explanation for what is going on here? Why does photosynthesis going on in the southern hemisphere summer not make up for this deficit brought on by the dropping of leaves during winter in the northern hemisphere? Can you guys see Google Earth? As we spin the Earth around the equator, what do you notice about the world?
Majority of the land mass is north.
The majority of the landmass is in the northern hemisphere. If we look down at the Earth from the top, you see all this landmass, the boreal forests of Europe and Russia. You see the boreal forests of North America. You see all that landmass. And when we look at the world from the bottom, of the world, what do we see?
Antarctica.
We see Antarctica, which isn't responsible for a lot of photosynthesis at all because it's covered in snow and ice most of the time. And around Antarctica, what do we see? Wide open ocean.
Water.
Yep. And so most of the landmass of the world at this particular time in geological history is located in the northern parts of the world. And so whatever happens in northern land masses is going to affect global climate because that's where most of the plants are located that lose their leaves seasonally. Around the equator, there are forests that are evergreen. So in these tropical forests, these guys keep their leaves all year round. These guys keep their leaves all year round. But all of these land masses in the north will lose their leaves during the winter. And when you look at Europe and Asia, that's a huge landmass of trees that are deciduous, these trees that put on leaves during the growing season and then lose those leaves during the winter. In addition to that, some areas, so for example, throughout some areas of Malaysia, throughout areas of, now I'm probably making you dizzy spinning the world around like this, some areas in Central America have deciduous forests that are deciduous not because of winter, but because of drought. And so there's usually a dry season and a wet season. During the wet season, the trees put on leaves, and during the dry season, they will drop their leaves once again to conserve water. And so what you see is this yearly fluctuation is due to leaves being dropped by trees in the winter, primarily in the northern hemisphere, that decreases the rate of photosynthesis while the rate of cellular respiration stays the same, which leads to an export of carbon dioxide and excess export of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere in the winter, and then that all gets absorbed by trees in the following summer. Once again, this would just fluctuate back and forth, but it would fluctuate around a steady state sort of thing if humans weren't then also going and burning up a lot of fossil fuels and converting forests to agricultural land. That is what is mainly responsible for this steady increase in carbon dioxide over time. So carbon dioxide is one of these gases that is called a greenhouse gas. And it's called a greenhouse gas because carbon dioxide, if you were to put it into a bottle, carbon dioxide allows infrared light to pass, it allows UV light to pass through it, but it doesn't allow infrared light to pass through it. What happens to ultraviolet light when it hits the surface of the earth? It's reflected back not as ultraviolet light, it's reflected back as infrared light, the light wavelengths that lead to heat. And so because carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases are generally permeable to ultraviolet light, but impermeable to infrared light, it's kind of like when you leave your car out in the sunlight. The same thing is happening. Glass allows UV light to come through. It hits the surface of your seat and is reflected back as infrared, and glass doesn't do a very good job of letting infrared light through. And so this heat builds up in your car the same way that heat is building up on the earth. And so this is of concern to scientists, even though it's not of concern to politicians in most cases. So carbon cycle, introduced at the beginning because it's relatively easy to understand. Also, it's of some importance in terms of what's happening on the earth. Situations like what's happening in California, where you have all of these massive wildfires, they're just contributing to this export of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere. Not only do they contribute to the export of carbon dioxide back into the atmosphere, there are now also fewer plants there, which means that photosynthesis is going to be lower. So anytime you convert forests to agriculture or convert forests to bare ground because of things like wildfires, it increases carbon dioxide levels, both one from the additional carbon dioxide going in the atmosphere from the initial fire, but then also the reduced capacity of those ecosystems to absorb carbon in the future because there are just fewer plants on the ground. So fires are not so good for this whole thing. Questions about the carbon cycle? One question that you might have that I'm surprised you haven't asked is, how on earth am I going to ask about this on a test? So I might give you a nutrient cycle, and then I'll ask you to explain certain things about the nutrient cycle. Or I might give you a nutrient cycle and ask you to tell me whether that nutrient cycle is balanced or not. And when I talk about balanced, what I mean is, do the flows, do the fluxes equal one another such that the amount of carbon dioxide coming out of the atmosphere and into the biota is the same as the amount of carbon dioxide going back into the atmosphere, or is it imbalanced in some particular way, such that there's an unequal movement of substances from one part of the system to another part of the system. And what we're going to see with nitrogen is relatively unbalanced because it's a nutrient that tends to leak out of ecosystems pretty commonly. And we'll discuss why it's a leaky, sometimes referred to as a leaky cycle as we go through that cycle. So those are the types of questions that I might ask you. I might give you a cycle, ask you to make some general comments and interpretations of it, or I might ask you about that cycle as to whether it's balanced or not. You would have to be able to look at the numbers and see if it's balanced or not. What I'm never going to ask you to do is I'm never going to give you a blank sheet of paper and say, draw the carbon cycle with all of the numbers and all the fluxes and all the pools, because that would be ridiculous to do on an exam. And Olivia's like, yes, don't ask us to do that. So like a lot of things I do in this class, sometimes I'll give you something on a test that gives you some basis for forming an answer, and then I'll ask you to interpret that thing that I've given you information about. All right. Easy is over now, because now we're going to turn our attention to nitrogen. Oh, carbon. I didn't finish carbon cycle. I forgot that I had this in here. So this is a figure from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They put out reports every 5 years, and I generally try and read the report when it comes out. This is a figure basically showing patterns of global temperature over a long period of time, about 100 years. And it's showing what they do is and I wish we were actually in class. This is one time, Olivia, when I wish we were in class, because I would take you through a little modeling exercise as to how models work. So at the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, they do modeling exercises where they try and take all of the things that have the potential to influence global climate, and they put them into a big computer simulation. And they basically ask that computer simulation, if we start off with what we know back in 1900 about all of these different variables, the amount of factory outputs, the amount of fossil fuel burning, the amount of radiation coming from the sun, et cetera, and put all of these into a model, how well would that model predict what we know is the known pattern of global climate since, over some historic period where we know things. And what they will do is they will tweak that model until they get it to the point that all of these drivers, what they call drivers or forcing factors that are thought to influence climate, until they have them weighted in the model such that those things will then track historical climate change, historical temperatures, global temperatures. And then once they have that model calibrated, they can look at, well, given the current data, what would we expect to happen in the future? And so because they have all of these different variables, some of these variables are natural variables and some of these variables are human-related variables, they can also then pull these variables out and say, well, what would the model have produced in terms of global temperature if human activities were not part of it? And so that's where they get this thing, where it says natural and human factors versus natural factors only. And you can see that this increase in climate that has been happening since the mid 60s is mainly due to natural and human factors rather than just natural factors alone. And they just did this by pulling out the human factors and asking, okay, if nature were just left to its own devices, what would be happening to temperature? Well, temperature would be fluctuating. Do you guys know what these dips are due to? There's a dip here, there's a dip here, there's a dip here, there's a dip here. Any ideas why these dips occur? What's something that happens that occasionally radically increases the amount of stuff that is in the atmosphere that might filter out sunlight?
Volcanic eruptions.
Volcanic eruptions. So this is the eruption of Mount St. Helens. I believe it was 1982. All of that ash, can you guys see the image? All of that ash goes into the upper atmosphere. And once it gets up into the upper atmosphere, it spreads around the world. And it can be enough of a pollutant up in the upper atmosphere that it can actually filter enough sunlight that it will cool the overall environment of the Earth by a noticeable and recordable difference. And the other thing is it gets so high up in the atmosphere that it takes, in some cases, multiple years before that finally all settles out and things kind of go back to normal. And so anytime you have large volcanic eruptions, either a single large eruption or multiple eruptions, you can expect to see declines in global temperature. So this little dip here, this minor dip here, this dip here, this dip here. Turns out these are all tied to large eruptions that have happened in one part of the world or another. So there are natural fluctuations. Some of these natural fluctuations are tied to natural events like volcanic eruptions. But this is what the pattern would be if humans weren't basically converting large amounts of land to agriculture and weren't burning a crap load ton of fossil fuels. So if we were in class, I would actually illustrate to you kind of how models work. And I would do it with a racquetball, and I would do it with a dry erase board eraser. If you throw a racquetball at somebody, it's easy for that person to know exactly where that ball is going to be so that they can catch it. And so I would just sit there, and as I'm explaining how models work, I would just be passing a racquetball back between you and me. I would pick one of you and we would just play catch and class for a little while. But the nice thing about a racquetball is it's smooth and it's round. And because of that, the physics of a racquetball going through space are pretty predictable. And somewhere in our brains have kind of worked out the math of the trajectory of a racquetball based on how fast you throw it and how far away the person is, et cetera, et cetera. If you throw a racquetball really fast, how do you have to change the trajectory of the racquetball to make sure it makes it to the person? If you're throwing a ball hard. Do you lob it to them or do you throw it straight? You guys have never played catch?
You throw it straight.
Yeah, if you're throwing a ball straight, you throw it. If you throw a ball hard, you throw it straight because the speed of the ball, the physics of it work like this. Gravity pulls down on things at a certain rate. And so if you're throwing a ball really fast, you throw it straight because the speed of it means but it's not going to be in the air for very long, and so it's not going to fall for very long. If you throw a ball slow, what do you have to do with it to get it to the person?
Lob it.
You have to lob it. And you lob it because it's traveling at a slower speed. Because it's traveling at a slower speed, it's going to take more time to cross this barrier, to cross this distance. And during that time, gravity is constantly pulling down on it. And so you just through experience, your brain has done the complex physics that is necessary in order to basically calculate the difference between how much do I have to lob it versus how much do I have to send it straight, depending on how fast I'm throwing the ball. And if you're a baseball pitcher, this is just instinctual to you. Who's that smiling? Who is that?
That's me.
Oh, Jackson. Jackson, do you play baseball?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, so you know this intimately. But it's easy for your brain to wrap itself around that because the ball is smooth. A racquetball in particular is smooth. It's smooth, it has a certain mass, it doesn't really change. Now, if we take an Expo eraser, which has hardly any mass to it whatsoever, and we want to fling it at somebody, what happens when you throw an Expo eraser at a student? Not that I would ever advocate that faculty do that. Actually, we had a faculty member once who threw erasers at students and eventually went and taught someplace else because of behavior like that. Jackson, what happens when we throw an Expo eraser at somebody?
It's probably not going to be as accurate because it weighs less.
Okay, so it's not going to be accurate because it weighs less. What else does it have going against it?
The shape, it's not like aerodynamic, like smooth.
It's not smooth, and even
like
worse than smooth, what else is going on with it? It's rectangular. What else?
Because of the different materials.
This side is relatively smooth because it's the hard styrofoam, hard styrofoam. This side has a lot of drag associated with it because that's the felt that you do the erasing with. So it's not round, it's not smooth, and even worse, it's smoother on one side than it is on the other side. And so figuring out how you have to chuck this at somebody to make sure that it gets there becomes a much more complicated thing. And if you saw me throwing this at students in the class, you would see that sometimes it makes it to them and sometimes it just goes totally off to one side, totally off to the other side. Sometimes it doesn't even make it to them. That's the difference, though, between simple models and more complex models. A simple model is really easy to model the predictions of where something is going to be in the future because the number of parameters that you have to model accurately is relatively low. It's throwing a racquetball and knowing where that racquetball is going to be so that you can catch it. Modeling climate is a complex enough system that there's more uncertainty associated with it because it has more complexity built into it. It's more like trying to model where the dry erase board eraser is going to be at some point in the future when you throw it, because there's just more variables to take into account to predict that. And so climate is inevitably difficult to model, but in spite of that, mainly because we have gigantic computers, we can model climate pretty well. All right. Enough talking about racquetballs and erasers. So now I just want to introduce you to the nitrogen cycle, and I'll get some facty information down to you today, and then we'll actually work on the modeling on Monday. I now have dry erase marker dust all over my table. All right, so nitrogen. Nitrogen is super abundant in the atmosphere, so that atmospheric pool is going to be giant. The problem with the nitrogen that is in the atmosphere is that it's largely not usable to most organisms. And the reason for this is that when you look at the outer shell of electrons in nitrogen, it has 3 unpaired electrons. And as a result, it can form these triple bonds really easily. And with each new bond that you make, that the bonds holding those 2 nitrogen atoms together become stronger and stronger. And so that's one of the problems with using nitrogen in its gaseous form, N2, is that those atoms are bonded together very strongly such that they're difficult to break apart. And so the way we get nitrogen out of the atmosphere is through a process called nitrogen fixation. Michael Pollan's book talks about industrial fixation, where humans can use fossil fuels to basically get the energy to facilitate this, this breaking of N2. But there are also organisms that are capable of doing this, but these organisms are typically bacteria. So we can take a molecule of nitrogen from the atmosphere, we can combine it with basically hydrogen to create ammonia. And once it's in the form of ammonia, it's then usable to lots of different kinds of organisms. And so this nitrogen fixation, by which atmospheric nitrogen is converted into ammonia, is usually carried out by bacteria, but it's not carried out by all bacteria. There are only certain types of bacteria that have this ability. So they possess the enzymes that allow them to break apart this nitrogen and convert it to ammonia. Rhizobium can do it, Frankia can do it, Azotobacter can do it. This is a type of cyanobacteria. So all of these things, Rhizobium in particular, are associated with plants, and then we have these free-living soil bacteria and cyanobacteria. But we're going to concentrate mainly on Rhizobium because it's one of the major groups of bacteria that is associated with plants. And the plants that they are associated with are legumes. Legumes are the beans and peas, chickpeas, lentils, all these things. These are plants that have pinnately compound leaves. The leaf structure of the plant looks like this. They have compound leaves. And the leaves are distributed on the leaflet like this. So if you go out and you see a honey locust tree or a black locust tree here in the Midwest, you look at those leaves look like this. And they also have seeds that are born in pods. These are 2 good characters for identifying the Fabaceae, which is the family of legumes. So in the family Fabaceae. So honey locust, black locust are good tree species that are found here in the Midwest that are members of this family. And then we have also all kinds of other plants that are in this family that are native to this area, which you're probably not familiar with because you don't study prairies. But garden peas, chickpeas, edamame, soybeans, all those things are in this family. So they have bacteria that are associated with their roots. They have these little things called root nodules that that's where these bacteria are housed. And these bacteria possess the enzymes that allow them to fix nitrogen, do this initial nitrogen fixation, taking atmospheric nitrogen and converting it into an absorbable form that plants can absorb. Once it's in this absorbable form, the plants can then use it to create amino acids, and then they can use it to construct proteins. And so one of the reasons that you should be eating bean crops is because bean crops are a very good source of protein. When I was in graduate school, If you're a poor graduate student, you live off of rice and beans. And one of the reasons that you live off of rice and beans is that rice is a good form of carbohydrates and beans are a good form of protein. So you get two essential things that you need from your diet from just those two simple products. A diet of rice and beans, which quite frankly sustains a lot of people in the world. It's 9:59, so before we get too much further into this, I think maybe what I want to do is just end material for today so that I don't overload you, and we'll pick up nitrogen more on Monday. And this will give us a couple of minutes to answer any questions you might have. Questions about nutrient cycling? Questions about genetically engineered organisms as you read through your reports and work with your groups?
I don't have a
Yeah,
question
go ahead, Benson.
about that. That's due Friday.
What is?
The presentations.
No, that's due the following Monday, because on Friday you have what?
Following Monday. Okay. The test.
The Friday you have a test. Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Let me go and make sure that I am telling you the truth, but I'm 99.9% sure that I am correct. Because I have to be thinking about test construction now because it takes time to do that. There it is. It was already open. Yeah, Friday the 16th is the exam, and the food presentations are the Monday after that. Now, let me know how things are going, because once again, that's a kind of flexible date. We can still move around the schedule somewhat if you need more time, but I don't want to put it off much longer than that, because I also want to give you time to work on your actual paper after you've done the presentation. So once again, one of the purposes of the presentation is to get you prepared in terms of how you think about this material, how you organize this material, how you talk about this material, so that you'll be better prepared to sit down and write a position paper about the material. But I need you guys to be communicating with me saying, okay, how's it going? It's taking us a little longer to get our act together, whatever. I'm somewhat flexible on that, but I'm not infinitely flexible on that. One of my goals of teaching this semester, although it's my goal usually, is to alleviate stress and anxiety as much as I can, given the conditions that we're all learning and teaching under. But there's a certain limit to which I can juggle the schedule to facilitate that. But the degree to which I can, I'm happy to do that. Are you able to get in contact with your other group members? Okay. You can all see everybody's name when everybody's here. Not everybody's here every day, as we know. But the other thing is, if you forget a person's last name or something like that, you can go to Jules Central, the intranet on campus, and go under the faculty tab and get class rosters. And so you can actually see all of the people that are in your class. And so the other thing you can do is just drop me an email and say, hey, I can't remember this person's last name. The other thing is, when I send out emails to the entire class, you're all carbon copied on that. So all of your emails are also in those emails if you go and look at who received them. So there are plenty of ways of tracking down your classmates, as long as they're not just totally ignoring your emails when they receive them. As you coordinate getting your talks together, you can meet via Zoom if you want. You can meet in person as long as you're doing social distancing. The other thing that you can do is, if you want me to hang out on some of those meetings to answer questions and things like that, once again, just make an appointment. I'll be happy to do that as well. In the past, groups have come into my office and gone through their presentation and stuff like that to see how it's going. So I'm open to that as well. Other questions? All right, then have a good weekend, and I'll see you on Monday.